We've all judged someone too quickly, only to discover how wrong we were. Sometimes the people we dismiss as unremarkable turn out to be the very ones who change our lives forever. At a Viking feast in Clan Vargheim, Svala mocked Kjell for his simple work serving food and ale. She saw his rough hands and quiet manner as signs of weakness. After all, real warriors boast of their battles and carry gleaming swords. But that night, when raiders attacked and Svala found herself wounded and trapped, everything changed. The man she had ridiculed became her salvation, charging into danger with nothing but a woodcutter's axe and unwavering courage. In those desperate moments, she learned that true strength often hides behind humble service. What drove this quiet man to risk his life for someone who had just humiliated him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn winds carried the scent of ripening barley across the settlement of Clan Vargheim, where smoke rose from countless hearths preparing for the harvest feast. In the great hall, carved from ancient oak and adorned with shields that bore the scars of 100 battles, the air hummed with anticipation. Tonight would mark not just the end of another successful growing season, but a celebration of survival in these harsh northern lands where winter's teeth grew sharper each year. Svala Eriksdottir moved through the preparations with the grace of one born to command. Her silver armring, a twisted serpent that caught the firelight with every gesture, marked her as daughter of the late war chief Eric the Bold. The precious metal gleamed against her strong forearm as she directed the servants in arranging the high table, her voice carrying the authority that came from noble blood and hard-earned respect. At 25, she had proven herself in 3 raids against coastal settlements, her sword arm as steady as her father's had been, her strategic mind sharp enough to earn grudging nods from the grey-bearded warriors who remembered when she was barely tall enough to reach a horse's stirrup. "The mead barrels go there," she instructed, pointing to the space near the fire where the clan's most honored would sit. "And mind the cups. Tonight we drink from silver, not horn." Her words carried the weight of tradition. The harvest feast was sacred, a time when the gods looked favorably upon those who celebrated their bounty with proper reverence and generous hospitality. The hall itself spoke of generations of prosperity and warfare. Tapestries depicting great victories hung between iron sconces that had been forged by craftsmen whose names were now carved in rune stones. The long tables, worn smooth by countless gatherings, could seat 200 souls when the clan came together in full strength. Tonight they would overflow with roasted boar, fresh bread, wheels of aged cheese, and vegetables pulled from the earth just days before. Among those preparing the feast moved Kjell Ironhand, though few knew his family name or bothered to learn it. His worn leather apron bore the stains of honest labor, grease from countless meals prepared, wine from flagons filled, and the honest sweat of a man who worked with his hands. Unlike the warriors who would soon fill these benches with tales of their exploits, Kjell moved quietly through his duties, checking that the carving knives were sharp, the serving platters clean, the ale barrels properly tapped. He was a man of perhaps 30 winters, though the lines around his eyes and the calluses on his palms spoke of someone who had lived each year fully. His hands, broad and strong from years of cutting wood and hauling water, handled the delicate silver goblets with surprising gentleness. There was something in his bearing, a straightness to his shoulders, a careful way he observed everything around him that suggested depths beneath the surface of his humble station. "Kjell," called Magnus the keeper, the settlement's steward who managed the daily operations that kept 200 souls fed and housed. "The war chief's chair needs attention. The cushion has come loose again." "I'll see to it," Kjell replied, his voice carrying a quiet strength that somehow never seemed to demand attention. He moved toward the ornate chair that had been Eric's throne during feast times, now kept in honor of his memory and as a symbol of the leadership that would one day pass to another. The chair, carved with intricate knotwork and inlaid with amber, had been Eric's pride. Svala insisted it remain in its place of honor, though she herself sat to its right, rather than claiming it directly. As Kjell worked, carefully tightening the leather cords that held the woolen cushion in place, other preparations continued around him. The younger warriors polished their weapons and boasted to anyone who would listen about their latest adventures. Olaf Stormcrow regaled a group of wide-eyed boys with tales of his raid on a Frankish monastery, while Gunnar Splitbeard demonstrated sword techniques with theatrical flourishes that drew appreciative laughter. The women of the settlement moved with their own purposeful energy. The wives of warriors wore their finest brooches and arm rings, their hair braided with ribbons that caught the light. They supervised the cooking of the great feast, tasting broths and adjusting seasonings with the expertise of those who had fed families through long winters. Their daughters, some barely past childhood, learned by watching and helping, understanding that the skills of hospitality were as important as any warrior's training. Elder Thorvald sat near the fire, his ancient bones grateful for the warmth as he watched the preparations with eyes that had seen 40 such feasts. His weathered hands, gnarled like old oak roots, rested on a walking stick carved with runes that told the story of his own youth when he had sailed with Eric's father to lands beyond the horizon. He observed everything with the patience of age, occasionally offering quiet guidance to those who sought his counsel. A good harvest, he remarked to no one in particular, though several younger men gathered closer to hear his words. The gods have been generous this year. The barley stands tall, the cattle grow fat, and our stores will see us through the ice months, with plenty to spare. He paused, studying the faces around him. But remember, prosperity can make men careless. A full belly sometimes means an empty head for watching the horizon. His words carried the weight of experience, for Thorvald had lived through raids and famines, through seasons of plenty and years when the clan had huddled together through winters that seemed endless. The younger warriors nodded respectfully, though some clearly thought his caution excessive on such a night of celebration. As the afternoon sun slanted through the smoke holes in the roof, casting long shadows across the rush-strewn floor, the transformation of the hall neared completion. Fresh rushes covered the ground, sprinkled with sweet herbs that would release their fragrance when crushed underfoot. The walls gleamed with polished weapons and burnished shields that served as both decoration and reminder of the clan's strength. Banners hung from the rafters, their bright colors declaring the allegiance and achievements of Clan Vargheim. Kjell finished his work on the war chief's chair and moved on to other tasks, checking that the great hearth burned evenly, that the torches were properly secured in their brackets, that the musician's corner held enough space for the evening's entertainment. He worked with the thorough attention of someone who understood that small details often determined the success of grand occasions. Svala paused in her own preparations to observe the hall. Everything appeared ready, the tables set with the clan's finest vessels, the food prepared to perfection, the ale flowing freely from barrels that had aged through the summer months. Yet something nagged at her, a restlessness that had nothing to do with the feast preparations. Perhaps it was the recent reports from traders about raiders striking settlements to the south, or maybe it was simply the weight of responsibility that came with her position as the war chief's daughter. Her father had trained her not just in combat, but in the subtler arts of leadership. Watch everything, he had told her during her childhood. The way a man holds his cup, how he treats those beneath his station, whether his eyes meet yours when he speaks of honor. These things tell you more than any boast of battlefield prowess. She had taken those lessons to heart, and now she found herself studying the people around, her with the calculating gaze of one who must judge character and loyalty. The late afternoon brought the arrival of guests from neighboring homesteads, farmers and craftsmen, who lived within a day's ride of the main settlement. They came bearing gifts of their own harvest bounty and news from the wider world. Their weathered faces spoke of hard work under open skies, their clothes practical rather than ornamental. But their presence at the feast honored both host and tradition, Children ran between the adults' legs, their excitement building as they caught glimpses of the preparations. For them, the harvest feast meant honey cakes and sweet mead, stories told by firelight, and the rare privilege of staying awake long past their usual bedtime. Their laughter echoed through the hall, a sound that brought smiles to even the sternest warrior's face. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the clan began to gather in earnest. The hall filled with voices speaking in the musical cadences of their northern tongue, with the clink of metal on metal as weapons were set aside, with the rustle of fine clothes donned for the occasion. The great feast of Clan Vargheim was about to begin, though none yet suspected that before the night ended, everything they thought they knew about courage and honor would be tested in ways they could never imagine. In the growing shadows beyond the settlement's borders, other eyes watched the warm glow emanating from the great hall. But for now, in these final moments of preparation, the clan existed in perfect anticipation of celebration. Unaware that their peaceful world was about to change forever, the great horn sounded 3 times, its deep voice echoing across the settlement and calling all souls to the harvest feast. As tradition demanded, Elder Thorvald rose first, his ancient hands lifting the Jarl's ceremonial horn, a magnificent vessel carved from the tusk of some long-dead beast and bound with silver rings that caught the firelight. The horn had been filled with the finest mead, aged in oak barrels and sweetened with wild honey gathered from the forest hives. "To the gods who granted us another harvest," Thorvald's voice carried clearly through the packed hall. "To the earth that yielded her bounty, and to the clan that stands strong against all storms." He drank deeply, then passed the horn to Svala, who sat in the place of honor beside her father's empty chair. As the horn made its way around the high table, the feast began in earnest. Servants moved between the tables, carrying platters heavy with roasted meat and baskets of fresh bread still warm from the ovens. The air filled with the rich aromas of the meal, and the sound of voices raised in appreciation. Warriors shared tales of summer raids, while farmers spoke of grain yields and livestock prosperity. Kjell moved efficiently among the tables, his worn leather apron marking him as clearly as any banner. He carved meat with practiced strokes, filled cups from heavy pitchers, and cleared away empty platters without drawing attention to himself. His movements held an economy of motion that spoke of long experience, though few at the feast bothered to notice such details. It was when he approached the high table, carrying a fresh platter of carved boar, that Svala first truly noticed him that evening. Perhaps it was the mead working its way through her system, or perhaps it was simply the high spirits of the celebration. But something about his quiet efficiency sparked a cruel impulse in her mind. "Kjell Ironhand," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby tables. The name itself was almost a jest. His hands bore no iron rings of wealth or station, only the calluses of honest labor. "Tell us, what great deeds have you accomplished this season? What enemies have fallen to your mighty blade?" Laughter rippled through the nearby benches. The warriors, seated around the high table, turned their attention to the exchange, some grinning in anticipation of entertainment. Kjell paused in his serving, the heavy platter balanced in his strong hands, but made no immediate reply. "Come now," Svala continued, warming to her theme as she saw she had an audience. "Surely a man with such an impressive name has stories to share. Or perhaps your greatest victory was against a particularly stubborn piece of firewood." More laughter followed, and she felt the familiar rush of being the center of attention, of commanding the room with her wit. Gunnar Splitbeard, well into his cups, picked up the theme. "Aye, tell us, Kjell, have you slain any especially fierce turnips this season? Led any daring raids against the chicken coop?" The hall erupted in laughter, the sound echoing off the carved rafters. Through it all, Kjell stood quietly, neither responding to the mockery nor showing anger at the treatment. His eyes remained steady, focused on his work, as he continued to serve the meal. There was something in his bearing, a dignity that remained intact despite the circumstances, that might have given Svala a pause had she been paying closer attention. Perhaps he's saving his strength, offered Olaf Stormcrow, raising his cup with theatrical grandeur. After all, someone must be ready to defend us if the chickens decide to rebel. The jest drew another wave of laughter, and even some of the women at the lower tables joined in the amusement. Magnus, the keeper, seated at a side table, frowned at the display but held his tongue. He had worked alongside Kjell for several seasons and knew him to be reliable, thoughtful, and surprisingly knowledgeable about matters beyond his station. But pointing this out during such a moment would only draw the mockery toward himself. And Magnus had learned the wisdom of choosing his battles carefully. As the evening progressed and the mead flowed more freely, the celebration grew louder and more boisterous. Warriors competed in tests of strength, arm wrestling across the tables while others cheered. Stories grew taller with each telling, and the hall filled with the kind of raucous joy that comes when hard-working people allow themselves to truly celebrate. Kjell continued his duties throughout, moving through the crowd like a shadow, ensuring that cups remained filled and platters remained loaded with food. If the earlier mockery had affected him, he showed no sign of it. His face remained calm, his movements purposeful, his attention focused on the tasks at hand. It was near midnight when the first signs of trouble appeared, though few in the hall noticed them initially. A serving boy who had been sent to check on the watchposts failed to return. One of the younger warriors, gone out to relieve himself, took longer than expected to come back inside. These small absences might have been easily explained on any normal night, but Elder Thorvald had not lived to his advanced age by ignoring such details. "Something's not right," he murmured to Magnus, his weathered hand gripping his walking stick more tightly. "Too many missing faces, too much quiet from outside." Magnus nodded, his own instincts beginning to sound warnings. The settlement should not be so still around its edges while the great hall celebrated. There should be sounds of guards moving along their routes, the occasional bark of dogs, the normal noises of a community at rest. Instead, there was an ominous silence pressing in from the darkness beyond the firelight. Before either man could voice their concerns more widely, the silence was shattered by a sound that sent ice through every warrior's veins, the whistle of arrows fired in volleys. The great doors of the hall burst open, not from within but from outside force, and dark figures poured through the entrance like water through a broken dam. The raiders came in a coordinated rush, their weapons already drawn, their faces painted with war markings that made them appear more beast than human in the flickering firelight. They had clearly planned their attack carefully, striking when the clan's warriors were relaxed, well-fed, and many far from their weapons. Chaos erupted instantly. Tables overturned as warriors scrambled for their weapons, sending food and drink cascading across the rush-covered floor. Women screamed, children cried, and the ordered celebration transformed into deadly confusion. The ceremonial horn fell to the ground, its precious contents spreading in a dark stain across the ancient wood. Svala reacted with the speed of trained reflexes, rolling away from the high table and reaching for the sword that hung from her chair. Her father's lessons took over, pushing aside the shock and fear to focus on survival and defense. Around her, the other warriors were doing the same, but the attackers had gained precious seconds of advantage through surprise. "Vargheim stands," she shouted, her voice cutting through the confusion as she raised her blade. The clan's battle cry was taken up by other voices, creating some order in the chaos. But even as she prepared to fight, Svala could see that they faced a serious threat. These were not random bandits or opportunistic raiders. They moved with discipline and purpose, clearly knowing the hall's layout and having planned their attack down to the smallest detail. In the confusion of overturning tables and clashing weapons, Kjell seemed to simply vanish. One moment he had been there, still holding his serving pitcher, and the next he was gone, as if the shadows had swallowed him. Svala, engaged in parrying the thrust of a raider's spear, barely noticed his disappearance. In her mind, shaped by the evening's earlier mockery, his absence only confirmed what she had already believed, that when real danger came, the humble servant had fled to save his own skin. The battle for the Great Hall had begun, and with it, a night that would transform everything the clan thought they knew about courage, honor, and the true nature of heroism. But in those first crucial moments of violence and confusion, no one could have imagined how profoundly the events of this single night would change their understanding of who among them possessed the strongest heart. The Great Hall became a battlefield of flashing steel and desperate courage. Svala fought with the skill her father had drilled into her through countless training sessions, her sword moving in precise arcs that spoke of years spent mastering the warrior's craft. Around her, the clan's fighters rallied despite their disadvantage, turning benches into barriers and using whatever weapons came to hand. But the raiders had planned well. They struck from multiple entrances simultaneously, having clearly observed the settlement's defenses during the daylight hours. Their leader, a tall man with ritual scars covering his arms and a voice like grinding stone, shouted orders in the same tongue spoken by Clan Vargheim. These were not foreign invaders, but exiled Norse, warriors cast out from their own clans, and now united in their hunger for revenge and plunder. "Take the high-born alive," the scarred leader commanded, his eyes fixed on Svala as she cut down one of his men. "The others are meat for the ravens." Gunnar Splitbeard fought with the fury of a man defending his hearth, his great axe cleaving through raider shields like they were made of bark. But even his legendary strength could not be everywhere at once, and the attackers pressed their advantage of numbers and surprise. Elder Thorvald, despite his age, had managed to reach an old spear from the wall and stood guard over the women and children who had clustered near the back of the hall. In the confusion, Svala found herself pressed toward a side entrance, fighting a running battle against 3 raiders who seemed determined to separate her from the main group. Her sword, her father's blade, reforged to fit her smaller hands, rang against their weapons in a deadly song of survival. But she was being driven steadily away from her people, and she began to realize this was exactly what the attackers intended. As she backed through the side door, still fending off her pursuers, Svala caught a glimpse of Kjell's woodcutting axe lying abandoned near a pile of split logs. The sight of it sparked a flash of anger, even in the midst of mortal danger. So the coward had indeed fled, dropping his tools and abandoning the clan when courage was needed most. The thought burned in her mind as she continued her fighting retreat into the darkness beyond the hall. The night air felt cold against her skin after the heat of battle, and the sounds of combat from the hall seemed strangely muffled. Her 3 pursuers advanced more cautiously now that they were away from the crowd, clearly preferring to take her alive as their leader had commanded. The largest of them, a man with iron rings braided into his beard, spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "End this now, girl, and you'll live to see morning. Keep fighting, and we'll drag your broken body to our chief regardless." His companions spread out to flank her, their weapons gleaming in the light that spilled from the hall's windows. "I am Svala Eriksdotter," she replied, raising her sword in the guard position her father had taught her. "Daughter of Eric the Bold, and I do not yield to oathbreakers and cowards who strike from shadows." The raider with the iron beard laughed, a sound like grinding millstones. "Eric the Bold is food for worms now, and his proud daughter will learn humility before this night ends." He gestured to his companions, and they began to close in with the patient confidence of wolves cornering prey. Svala fought with desperate skill, but 3 experienced warriors were too many for any single fighter, even one trained as she had been. Her father's blade drew blood from 2 of her attackers, but they had armor, while she wore only the fine dress of a feast-goer. A thrust that should have been fatal was turned aside by boiled leather, while her own defenses grew increasingly strained. It was during this unequal combat that her sword struck something harder than steel, the iron boss of a shield held at precisely the right angle. The blade, which had served her family for 3 generations, developed a hairline crack that would prove fatal at the worst possible moment. As she parried a particularly vicious cut from the bearded raider's axe, her father's sword shattered just above the hilt. The broken weapon fell from her nerveless fingers, leaving her holding only the useless stub of what had once been her pride. The three raiders closed in immediately, sensing victory. Ironbeard's companions seized her arms, while their leader approached with the casual swagger of a man who had never doubted the outcome. "Not so proud now, are you, daughter of the dead?" He reached out to touch her face with one grimy finger, and she jerked away with all the defiance she could muster. "Our chief has particular plans for Eric's blood. You're going to help us finish what your father started so many years ago." As they began to drag her away from the settlement, deeper into the forest where their horses waited, Svala's mind raced through possibilities for escape. But with her hands bound behind her back and surrounded by armed men, options seemed painfully limited. The sounds of battle from the hall were growing fainter, though she could still see the glow of fires against the night sky. It was then that she noticed the subtle wrongness in the forest around them. Small things, the way certain shadows fell, how some of the night sounds seemed too strategically placed, the occasional glint of metal where no metal should be. Either her captors were walking into an ambush, or her fear was making her see threats where none existed. The raiders seemed oblivious to any danger, talking among themselves about their success and the rewards their chief would distribute. They spoke of Svala as if she weren't there, discussing her fate with the casual cruelty of men who had long ago abandoned any pretense of honor. Their confidence was absolute, their attention focused on their captive rather than their surroundings. "The settlement burns well," observed one of the raiders, looking back toward the orange glow that marked Clan Vargheim's location. "By morning there'll be nothing left but ash and bones, and the beginning of our real work," added Ironbeard. This was just the opening move. When the other clans see what happened to mighty Vargheim, they'll remember why exile doesn't mean defeat. Svala filed away every word, understanding that this attack was part of something larger than simple raiding. These men represented a coordinated threat, not random violence. If she survived, if anyone survived, this information would be crucial for whatever came next. But survival seemed increasingly unlikely as they moved deeper into the forest, away from any hope of rescue. The broken pieces of her father's sword lay behind them in the grass, catching the distant firelight like scattered stars. With them lay her assumptions about strength, courage, and who could be counted upon when darkness fell and true tests began. In her desperation, she found herself thinking about the evening's earlier events, about the mockery she had directed toward Kjell and his quiet dignity in the face of her cruelty. Perhaps, she thought with bitter irony, her own situation now wasn't so different from his. Both of them had been judged and found wanting by those who held power over them. The difference was that Kjell had borne his humiliation with grace. While she had no idea how she would face whatever lay ahead, the forest seemed to close around them, like the walls of a trap, as the raiders led Svala deeper into territory she barely recognized. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches blocking out most of the starlight and creating a maze of shadows that could hide anything. Her father's shield, strapped to her back during the feast as a ceremonial honor, had taken several hard blows during the brief fight and now bore a crack that ran from rim to boss, another symbol of how quickly her world had shattered. The damaged shield bounced against her spine with each step, a constant reminder of her current helplessness. Eric the Bold had carried this shield through a dozen battles, had passed it to her with the words that it would protect her as it had protected him. Now it was as broken as everything else she had believed about strength and protection. Ironbeard seemed to enjoy her silence, interpreting it as the beginning of the submission he expected. "Still thinking rescue will come?" he asked, his voice carrying the mockery she had so recently directed at another. "Your precious clan warriors are either dead or scattered to the winds by now. No one's coming for Eric's daughter." But even as he spoke, Svala noticed that one of his companions kept glancing nervously at the shadows around them. The man had the lean build of a scout, and his unease began to infect her with a different kind of hope. Perhaps her earlier observations about wrongness in the forest had been correct. Perhaps something was indeed moving through the darkness parallel to their path. "Brock, what is you jumping at every shadow?" Ironbeard demanded of his nervous companion. "We're miles from the settlement now, and any survivors will be too busy fighting fires to mount pursuit." Brock paused, his head tilted as if listening to sounds the others couldn't hear. "Something's not right, Hakon. The forest is too quiet, and I keep seeing movement that doesn't match the wind patterns." He was clearly a man who had lived by trusting his instincts, and those instincts were screaming warnings. The third raider, younger and less experienced than his companions, laughed with the false bravado of someone trying to convince himself he wasn't afraid. "You're hearing ghosts, old man. What could possibly be out there? One cowardly servant who ran when the fighting started." Svala's mind seized on those words. Could it be that Kjell hadn't fled after all? Could his disappearance have been something other than cowardice? The possibility sparked a flame of hope that she tried hard to keep from showing on her face. She had learned enough about her captors to know that any sign of encouragement would only make them more cautious. As they continued through the forest, following what seemed to be a planned route toward some predetermined destination, the signs of pursuit became more obvious to anyone trained to look for them. A branch broken at shoulder height where no deer would reach. Footprints in soft earth that matched no animal track. The subtle displacement of forest debris that spoke of careful passage. Hakon Ironbeard was beginning to notice these signs too, his earlier confidence giving way to the wariness of a veteran warrior who had survived by never underestimating potential threats. He called a halt in a small clearing where moonlight filtered through a gap in the canopy, providing enough light to examine their surroundings more carefully. "Spread out," he ordered his companions. "Something is indeed following us, and I want to know what." He drew his seax, the long knife that had ended many lives, and tested its edge with his thumb. "If it's that servant boy playing hero, we'll gut him and leave his body for the ravens. If it's something else..." He left the threat unfinished. But his meaning was clear. The three raiders moved to form a protective triangle around Svala, their weapons ready and their attention focused outward. In the tense silence that followed, every small sound became magnified. The rustle of leaves in the night breeze, the distant call of a night bird, the soft whisper of cloth against bark as someone moved through the undergrowth with practiced stealth. It was then that Svala truly understood the difference between the violence of honest warfare and the calculated stalking of a predator. Whoever was out there in the darkness wasn't charging forward with battle cries and flashing steel. Instead, they moved with the patience of someone who understood that the greatest weapon was often timing, and that true strength sometimes required waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The memories of her father's teachings came flooding back, not the lessons about sword work and shield walls, but the quieter instructions about leadership and judgment. "The loudest warrior isn't always the strongest," Eric had told her during one of their walks through these very forests. "Sometimes the man who says the least sees the most. Watch for those who serve without seeking glory, daughter. They often possess courage that runs deeper than any battle song." At the time, she had nodded dutifully, but hadn't really understood what he meant. Her world had been filled with the obvious heroics of raid leaders and a clear hierarchy of those who fought and those who served. But now, bound and helpless while something stalked her captors through the darkness, she began to grasp the wisdom in her father's words. Brock suddenly stiffened, his scout's training alerting him to movement at the edge of the clearing. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a cluster of ancient birch trees whose white bark gleamed like bones in the moonlight. "Something's watching us from the birches." All three raiders turned their attention toward the indicated spot, their weapons raised and their bodies tense with anticipation. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with shocking suddenness, a figure emerged from the shadows, but not from where they were looking. The attack came from behind them, silent and swift as death itself. Kjell moved like a man who had spent years learning to make no sound when silence meant survival. His wood-cutting axe, which Svala had seen abandoned and assumed forgotten, swept in a horizontal arc that caught the youngest raider completely off guard. The man went down without even a cry of warning. His life ended before he understood that death had found him. In the sudden chaos that followed, as Hakon and Brock spun to face this unexpected threat, Svala finally understood that everything she thought she knew about courage, strength, and the nature of heroism had been as broken as her father's shield. The quiet man she had mocked for his humble service was proving to possess exactly the kind of deep, enduring courage her father had tried to teach her to recognize. But the battle was far from over, and 3 against 1 remained deadly odds, even with the advantage of surprise. As steel rang against steel in the moonlit clearing, Svala could only watch and pray that her earlier assumptions about who deserved respect and who deserved mockery wouldn't cost them both their lives. The moonlit clearing erupted into deadly combat as Hakon Ironbeard and Brock the Scout wheeled to face their unexpected attacker. Kjell stood over the body of the youngest raider, his wood-cutting axe gleaming with fresh blood, his stance that of a man who had faced death before and emerged victorious. There was something in his bearing now that Svala had never seen during his quiet service in the hall, a cold competence that spoke of skills learned in harder schools than any feast preparation. "So the servant finds courage after all," Hakon snarled, raising his sword while Brock circled to flank their opponent. "Tell me, kitchen boy, do you know how to use that wood chopper against men instead of logs?" Kjell's response came not in words, but in action. He moved with the fluid economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion meant death, his axe weaving defensive patterns that kept both raiders at bay while he sought his opening. The weapon that had seemed so humble in the context of feast preparations now revealed itself as a tool perfectly suited to its wielder's hands. As the 3 men engaged in their deadly dance, Svala caught sight of something that made her heart race with recognition. Protruding from beneath Kjell's rough tunic, barely visible in the moonlight, was the edge of a small brooch. Not the crude iron that might be expected of a servant, but the kind of worked silver that marked a warrior of proven worth. The design, what little she could see of it, bore the intricate knotwork that her father had favored for rewarding exceptional service. The sight triggered a cascade of memories she had previously dismissed, conversations overheard between her father and his closest advisors, mentions of a scout whose knowledge of the wilderness had proved invaluable during several crucial campaigns. References to someone who preferred to remain unnamed, who shunned recognition and rewards in favor of quiet service to the clan. Could it be that the man she had mocked as powerless was actually one of her father's most trusted warriors? But there was no time for reflection as the battle intensified. Brock, true to his scout training, sought to end the fight quickly with a thrown sayaxe aimed at Kjell's back. The blade flew true, but Kjell seemed to sense the attack without looking, dropping into a crouch that let the knife pass harmlessly. Overhead before rising to deliver a devastating counterstrike with his axe handle that sent Brock stumbling backward. Hakon pressed his advantage during this moment, his swordwork revealing why he had survived long enough to become a raider chief. His blade carved intricate patterns in the air, each stroke calculated to force Kjell into an untenable position. But the axe-wielder gave ground strategically, using the terrain of the clearing to his advantage, and never allowing himself to be cornered. It was during one of these tactical retreats that Svala noticed something that chilled her blood. Scattered around the edges of the clearing, partially hidden by undergrowth, lay several pieces of torn fabric, the distinctive blue and gold that marked the banners of Clan Vargheim. But these weren't random scraps torn during flight. They had been deliberately placed, arranged in patterns that would be meaningful to anyone who understood the old war codes her father had taught his most trusted lieutenants. The realization struck her like a physical blow. This entire attack hadn't been random violence or opportunistic raiding. Someone had planned it specifically to target her clan, someone who knew their customs, their defenses, and most importantly, their internal conflicts. The raiders weren't just exiled warriors seeking plunder. They were instruments of a carefully orchestrated revenge. Hakon's next words confirmed her fears. "Your father thought he was so clever," he panted between sword strokes, his voice carrying years of accumulated hatred. "Eric the Bold, destroyer of Clan Bloodraven, scatterer of the war hosts. Did he really think that exiling us would end the blood debt? Did he believe his precious daughter would be safe forever?" The torn banner pieces made sense now. They weren't trophies of victory, but markers left by advanced scouts, signs that would guide the main force of Bloodraven survivors to their targets. This clearing wasn't a random stopping point. It was a predetermined rally location where the scattered raiding parties would gather before the final phase of their assault. Kjell seemed to understand the implications as well, his fighting style shifting from defensive to desperately aggressive. He had to end this quickly, before reinforcements arrived to tip the odds beyond any hope of survival. His axework became a blur of motion, each stroke delivered with the kind of focused violence that comes from absolute commitment to victory or death. Brock, still staggered from the earlier blow, made the mistake of underestimating his opponent's reach. Kjell's axe caught him in the side, the blade biting deep enough to end the scout's contribution to the fight permanently. The man fell without a sound, his life's blood soaking into the forest floor. Now it was 1 against 1, and Hakon's earlier confidence began to crack. He had expected to face a frightened servant, not a skilled warrior who moved with the deadly precision of someone trained in the harshest possible school. His sword work remained dangerous, but desperation crept into his attacks as he realized that his mission was failing. "You cannot change what's coming," Hakon gasped, his breathing labored from the sustained combat. "The exile ends tonight. Bloodraven rises again, and Eric's line dies with his daughter." "Perhaps," Kjell replied, speaking for the first time since the fight began. His voice carried the quiet authority Svala remembered from his service, but now she heard the steel beneath the humble surface. "But not here, not tonight, and not by your hand." The final exchange came with shocking swiftness. Hakon committed, everything to a desperate thrust that should have ended the fight. But Kjell's response was a move Svala had seen her father practice countless times, a defensive pattern that turned an opponent's strength against them. The raider's own momentum carried him onto the axe blade, and he fell beside his companions with a look of surprise that death had come so unexpectedly. In the sudden silence that followed, as the echoes of combat faded into the night sounds of the forest, Svala found herself looking at Kjell with completely new eyes. The humble servant was gone, replaced by someone whose quiet competence spoke of depths she had never imagined. And somewhere in the distance, the orange glow of burning buildings reminded them both that the night's work was far from finished. The silence that followed the battle felt heavy with unspoken truths. Kjell moved efficiently among the fallen raiders, checking for signs of life and gathering their weapons with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that overlooked details could prove fatal. As he worked, Svala caught clearer glimpses of the brooch beneath his tunic, and her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the design. The silver piece bore the image of a raven in flight, wings spread wide above a mountain peak. It was a specific honor, one her father had commissioned for a single individual who had served beyond all expectation during the campaign against the coastal raiders 5 summers past. She had been present when Eric the Bold spoke of this unnamed hero, a scout whose intelligence and courage had prevented what could have been a devastating defeat for Clan Vargheim. "The Raven's Eye," she whispered, using the title her father had bestowed upon his most valued reconnaissance specialist. "You're the Raven's Eye?" Kjell paused in his work, his weathered hands stilling on the cord he was using to bind her wrists. For a moment, something flickered across his face, pain, perhaps, or regret. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrows and carefully buried memories. "That name died with your father," he said quietly, moving behind her to cut through the ropes that held her arms. "Eric Erickson asked me to set it aside, to become someone else entirely. He said the Raven's Eye had too many enemies, that my survival depended on becoming invisible." The bonds fell away, and Svala rubbed her wrists where the rough hemp had chafed her skin. As circulation returned to her hands, the pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Her father's mysterious absences during her childhood, when he would disappear for days at a time, with no explanation beyond clan business. The way certain conversations would stop when she entered a room, particularly those involving matters of strategy and intelligence. The occasional references to information that seemed to come from sources no one would name directly. "He protected you by hiding you," Svala said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Made you invisible so Bloodraven's surviving members couldn't target you for revenge. That's why you chose to work in the kitchens, why you never spoke of your past accomplishments." Kjell nodded, though his attention remained focused on their surroundings. Even in the aftermath of victory, he moved with the constant alertness of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. "Your father understood that the greatest victory means nothing if your enemies simply wait for another opportunity. Clan Bloodraven had good reason to want me dead. My intelligence gathering cost them everything they had built." The orange glow on the horizon was growing brighter, and the smell of smoke carried on the night wind brought home the reality of their situation. Whatever was happening at the settlement, it was far from over. Kjell seemed to read the same signs, his jaw tightening as he calculated distances and possibilities. "How many more of them are there?" Svala asked, though she suspected the answer would not bring comfort. "Too many," Kjell replied, checking the edge of his axe before securing it at his belt. "What we faced tonight was just the vanguard, enough to secure key targets and create confusion. The main force will be larger, better armed, and led by someone who has been planning this revenge for years." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the forest, still distant but growing closer. Multiple riders, moving with the confidence of those who knew exactly where they were going. Kjell's expression hardened as he recognized the implications. The scattered raiding parties were converging on their planned rally points, and this clearing had been chosen as one of those gathering places. "We need to move," he said, offering Svala one of the raiders' discarded seaxes. "Can you fight with a wounded arm?" She looked down at her left shoulder, where Brock's blade had found its mark during the earlier struggle. The wound was painful, but not crippling, and her sword arm remained strong. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that survival tonight would depend on more than just fighting skill. It would require the kind of strategic thinking that had made the Raven's Eye legendary. "I can fight," she confirmed, testing the balance of the unfamiliar weapon. "But where can we go? If Bloodraven has planned this as thoroughly as it appears, they'll have scouts watching every approach to the settlement." Kjell's smile was grim, but held a trace of the confidence that had once made him her father's most valued agent. They planned based on what they thought they knew about Clan Vargheim's defenses and capabilities. But there are paths through these woods that exist on no map, routes I used for years to move unseen between settlements. Your father made sure I knew every hidden way through this territory. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, accompanied by voices calling to each other in the organized manner of military units, coordinating their movements. Whatever window of opportunity they had for escape was closing rapidly. But as Kjell led her toward what appeared to be impenetrable undergrowth, Svala realized that her understanding of the night's events was still incomplete. "Why did you come after me?" she asked as they pushed through a gap in the thorns that was invisible until they were almost upon it. "After the way I treated you at the feast, after the mockery and humiliation, why risk your life for someone who showed you nothing but contempt?" Kjell paused, turning to meet her eyes in the filtered moonlight. What she saw there was not the humble acceptance she had grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more complex, duty mixed with loyalty. pain tempered by understanding, and beneath it all, an unshakable commitment to principles that transcended personal slights. "Because your father asked me to watch over you," he said simply. "Because protecting Eric's daughter was worth more than my wounded pride. And because—" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to voice the rest of his thoughts. "Because—" Svala prompted, genuinely curious about what this enigmatic man would say. "Because someone who has never faced real hardship cannot be blamed for not recognizing strength when it wears humble clothes," Kjell finished. "Your father taught me that lesson years ago, when I was young and certain that loud boasting was the same thing as courage. Tonight, you learned it too." Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew closer, but ahead lay the promise of safety through paths known only to those who had earned the right to walk them. As they disappeared into the deeper forest, Svala carried with her a new understanding of the man who had chosen service over glory, and the recognition that true strength often wore the most unexpected faces. They moved through the forest like ghosts, following paths that seemed to exist more in Kjell's memory than in any physical reality. Branches that appeared impenetrable parted at his touch, revealing passages that closed again behind them, as if the forest itself conspired to hide their passage. Svala marveled at his knowledge of this terrain, understanding now why her father had valued his reconnaissance skills so highly. The sounds of pursuit had faded into the distance, suggesting that their enemies were searching in the wrong direction. But Kjell remained alert, pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate they had been discovered. It was during one of these stops, as they crouched beside a stream that babbled its way toward the distant settlement, that he made a discovery that changed everything. Wedged beneath a fallen log, partially concealed by moss and debris, lay a leather satchel that bore the distinctive markings of Clan Vargheim's leadership. Kjell extracted it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as he examined its contents. Inside were documents that bore her father's personal seal, maps, correspondence, and what appeared to be detailed intelligence reports. "This shouldn't be here," he murmured, holding up a parchment covered in Eric's distinctive handwriting. "These are from your father's private study, documents that should have been secured behind locked doors in the main hall." Svala leaned closer, studying the papers by moonlight. What she saw made her blood run cold. The documents detailed every aspect of Clan Vargheim's defenses, from the timing of guard rotations to the locations of hidden weapons caches. More disturbing still were notes in her father's hand about Kjell himself, detailed records of his true identity, his skills, and most damaging of all, a map showing the secret paths they were now using to escape. "Someone took these from father's study," she whispered, the implications sinking in like ice in her veins. Someone with access to his private chambers, someone he trusted completely. Kjell's face had gone pale as he read further into the documents. Among them was a letter that bore the seal of Clan Bloodraven, not the broken remnants they had assumed were scattered in exile, but a formal communication between leadership groups. The letter was dated just 3 months past, well after the supposed destruction of Bloodraven's power. "Your father knew," Kjell said, his voice barely audible above the stream's murmur. "He knew that Bloodraven was rebuilding, that they were planning this attack. But more than that, he knew they had someone inside Vargheim feeding them information." The final document in the satchel was the most devastating of all. It was a detailed plan, written in Eric's careful script, outlining a strategy to identify and neutralize the traitor within his own clan. The plan involved using false information to trace the source of leaks, setting up situations where only certain individuals would have access to specific details, and then monitoring which information found its way to enemy ears. But the plan had never been completed. Eric the Bold had died suddenly in his sleep just 2 weeks after writing these notes, his heart giving out during what should have been the prime of his life. A death that had seemed natural at the time now carried far more sinister implications. He was getting close to discovering the truth, Svala realized, her hands trembling as she held her father's final strategic notes. Someone realized he was about to expose them, and they acted first. Kjell nodded grimly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The timing of tonight's attack makes sense now. They waited until you had inherited leadership responsibilities, but hadn't yet been fully briefed on your father's suspicions. They needed you alive to legitimize their eventual takeover of clan holdings, but they also needed you isolated from anyone who might know the truth about your father's investigation. The war chief's secret map was the final piece of evidence, showing not just the strategic situation Eric had been investigating, but also his contingency plans for protecting key assets, including the Raven's Eye if his suspicions proved correct. Kjell's enforced anonymity hadn't just been about protecting him from external enemies. It had been about keeping him safe from whoever was betraying the clan from within. Who had access to his private study? Kjell asked, though his expression suggested he was already forming suspicions of his own. Svala closed her eyes, thinking back through the routines of her father's final months. Magnus, the keeper, obviously. He managed all the household affairs. Elder Thorvald when they discussed matters of clan lore and tradition. The senior warriors when strategy was being planned. She paused, another thought occurring to her. And myself, though I rarely paid attention to his paperwork. Someone close enough to be trusted completely, Kjell mused, but ambitious enough to believe they could improve their position by betraying that trust. Someone who would have known about your father's heart problems and had access to things that might make them worse. The implications were staggering. Everything they had believed about tonight's attack was wrong. This wasn't revenge by exiled enemies striking from outside. It was a carefully orchestrated coup by someone within their own clan, someone who had used Bloodraven's genuine desire for revenge as a tool to achieve their own goals. We have to get back to the settlement, Svala said, urgency driving her to her feet. If the traitor is still there, they'll be positioning themselves to take control once the rescue arrives. They'll present themselves as the hero who saved what remained of the clan, and no one will question their authority. Kjell caught her arm, his expression troubled. Going back means walking into a trap. If our suspicions are correct, then everything about tonight has been designed to bring us to exactly this point. Desperate, isolated, and forced to return to a situation where our enemies hold all the advantages. Then what do you suggest? Svala demanded, though she could see the wisdom in his caution. Let them succeed. Allow the real enemy to claim leadership of my father's clan while we hide in the forest. I suggest we use the one advantage they don't know we have, Kjell replied, tapping the satchel of documents. They planned this, assuming your father took his suspicions to the grave. They don't know he left evidence, or that we've found it. That gives us an opportunity to turn their own plans against them. As he spoke, his demeanor shifted subtly, the humble servant disappearing entirely as the Raven's Eye emerged fully. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions, his bearing that of a strategist who had learned to see several moves ahead of his opponents. Your father's final map shows 3 emergency rally points, where loyal clan members could gather if the main settlement was compromised. Kjell continued, studying the documents by moonlight. If any of our people survive tonight's attack, they'll make for these locations. We can reach the nearest one by dawn, gather what forces remained loyal, and then return to deal with our real enemy. Svala looked back toward the distant glow that marked her home's destruction, understanding that everything she had believed about leadership, loyalty, and the nature of threats had been as false as her assumptions about the man beside her. The night had stripped away illusions about many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that the greatest dangers often wore the most trusted faces. Then we go, she decided, shouldering her pack with new determination. But when we return, it won't be as desperate refugees seeking rescue. It will be as warriors who know their enemy's name and have the evidence to prove their treachery. The discovery of her father's secret investigation had transformed everything. What had begun as a simple tale of rescue and redemption had become something far more complex. A story of betrayal, hidden loyalties, and the kind of long-term deception that could only succeed when it wore the mask of friendship. As they set off toward the first rally point, both Svala and Kjell understood that the real battle for Clan Vargheim's future was just beginning. Dawn broke grey and cold over the forest as Kjell led Svala toward the first rally point marked on her father's map. The early light revealed the full extent of the night's devastation. Columns of smoke rose from multiple locations across the valley, and the acrid smell of burned timber carried on the morning wind. But it also brought them something neither had dared hope for: the sight of other survivors making their way through the wilderness toward the same destination. The rally point was a natural amphitheater formed by ancient stones, hidden in a grove of oak trees that had stood since before the first Norse settlers arrived in these lands. As they approached, Svala counted nearly 30 figures gathered. Among the stones, warriors, craftsmen, and families who had managed to escape the night's assault. The sight brought tears of relief to her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away as she recognized the need to appear strong before those who looked to her for leadership. Elder Thorvald was among the survivors, his weathered face bearing new lines of exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken. He leaned heavily on his walking stick as he directed the organization of defenses around the clearing, his tactical experience proving invaluable even in this desperate situation. When he saw Svala and Kjell emerge from the forest path, his relief was evident. "Thank the gods," the old man said, gripping Svala's shoulders with hands that trembled slightly. "We feared you had been taken, or worse. The attack was coordinated beyond anything we expected. They knew exactly where to strike and when. More coordinated than you know," Svala replied grimly, producing the leather satchel they had discovered. "We found evidence that this wasn't just an external attack. Someone within our own clan has been feeding information to our enemies." The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Conversations stopped as those within hearing range absorbed the implications. Faces that had shown relief at her survival now displayed the haunted look of people whose world had been shaken to its foundations. The idea that their trusted leaders might include a traitor was almost too terrible to contemplate. Gunnar Split-Beard, his great axe still stained with the blood of enemies, stepped forward with the heavy tread of someone who had fought through the night without rest. His beard was singed from the fires, and his left arm bore a crude bandage where enemy steel had found its mark. "Show us this evidence," he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through deeds rather than birth. "If there's truth in what you say, then we need to know who we can trust and who we cannot." As Svala spread her father's documents on one of the flat stones, a crowd gathered around them. Kjell stood slightly apart, his presence drawing curious glances from those who had only known him as a humble servant. But his bearing now commanded respect. The way he positioned himself to watch all approaches, the casual competence with which he handled his weapons, the quiet authority in his voice when he spoke. These papers show that Eric the Bold suspected treachery for months before his death, Kjell explained, pointing to specific passages in the war chief's handwriting. He was systematically investigating who had access to sensitive information and how that information was reaching our enemies. His death interrupted that investigation. Magnus the Keeper pushed through the crowd, his face pale as he studied the documents. As steward of the clan's daily operations, he understood better than most what such betrayal would mean for their survival. His hands shook as he read through Eric's notes about defensive weaknesses and hidden supply caches. "If this is true," Magnus said slowly, "then whoever orchestrated last night's attack will be positioning themselves to claim leadership of what remains. They'll present themselves as our savior while secretly controlling our destruction." The ring of survivors grew quiet as the full implications sank in. They had escaped the immediate danger, but they were far from safe. Somewhere among their own people was an enemy who had helped orchestrate the previous night's devastation, someone who even now might be planning the final phase of their betrayal. It was then that Svala noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among her father's possessions that she wore was his signet ring, a heavy band of gold bearing the clan's raven symbol. She had put it on during the feast as a way of honoring his memory, but now she realized it carried significance she hadn't understood. In one of the documents they had found, Eric had written about using the ring as a test, planning to reveal false information to different people and see which version reached enemy ears. "The ring," she whispered, holding up her hand so the others could see the golden band. Father planned to use this as part of his investigation. He was going to feed different information to different suspects and see what leaked to our enemies. Kjell's eyes sharpened as he understood the implications. If he shared his suspicions with anyone before he died, they might have realized what the ring represented. That could explain why you were specifically targeted for capture rather than killing. They needed to recover it along with any other evidence of his investigation. The strategic situation was becoming clearer, but it brought little comfort. Their enemy was intelligent, patient, and had been planning this betrayal for months or even years. Worse, they were likely someone the survivors trusted implicitly, someone whose word would carry weight when decisions needed to be made about the clan's future. As the morning progressed, more survivors trickled into the rally point. Each arrival brought news of the settlement's fate. The great hall had burned almost completely, though the stone foundations remained intact. The attackers had withdrawn before dawn, taking prisoners and plunder, but leaving behind enough destruction to cripple the clan's immediate ability to mount organized resistance. But they also brought disturbing reports about the aftermath. Someone, identity unknown in the confusion, had been organizing rescue efforts and coordinating with neighboring clans for assistance. On the surface, this seemed like exactly the kind of leadership needed in a crisis. But knowing what they now knew about internal betrayal, such activity took on a more sinister cast. "We need to return to the settlement," Svala announced as the sun reached its zenith. "But not as desperate refugees seeking aid. We go back as warriors, carrying evidence of treachery, ready to expose the real enemy and reclaim what belongs to our people." The survivors looked to her with expressions that mixed hope with uncertainty. She was young to be claiming such authority, and her leadership had never been tested in circumstances like these. But the documents bearing her father's seal gave weight to her words, and the presence of the legendary Raven's Eye at her side suggested that Eric's preparations for this crisis had been more thorough than anyone had realized. Thorvald stepped forward, his ancient voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of many leaders. "If we do this, there can be no mistakes. We get one chance to expose the traitor before they consolidate their position. After that, they'll have the resources of the entire clan at their disposal, and will be branded as rebels and oathbreakers. Then we make sure we don't fail," Kjell said quietly, his words carrying the certainty of someone who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. "We use what your father taught us about strategy and misdirection. We give our enemy exactly what they expect to see, right up until the moment we don't." As the group began preparing for the journey back to their ravaged home, Svala felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything her father had tried to teach her about judgment, courage, and the price of command was about to be tested in the crucible of actual leadership. The humble servant she had mocked was now her most trusted advisor. The safe world she had known was revealed as riddled with deception, and the future of everyone she cared about depended on her ability to outmaneuver an enemy who had been planning this confrontation far longer than she had been preparing to meet it. But as she looked around at the faces of those who had chosen to follow her, Svala felt something new stirring within her. Not the proud confidence that had marked her earlier life, but a deeper, more enduring strength that came from understanding both her own limitations and her responsibilities to others. The night had burned away her illusions, but it had also forged something stronger in their place. The final test was yet to come, but she was no longer the same person who had mocked a humble servant for his quiet dignity. That transformation, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The ancient settlement bell that had called Clan Vargheim to arms for 3 generations hung silent and blackened in the ruins of the watchtower, its bronze surface scarred by the fires that had swept through the night. But as Svala and her band of loyal survivors approached the devastated settlement in the late afternoon, Kjell moved with purpose toward the damaged structure. "The bell still has voice," he said quietly, running his hands along the metal surface to check for cracks that might affect its tone. "Your father and I planned for this. If the settlement ever fell to internal treachery, the bell would be the signal to rally all true members of the clan, no matter where they might be scattered." The destruction around them was worse than the morning's distant view had suggested. Houses that had stood for generations were reduced to smoking timber and blackened stone. The Great Hall, pride of Clan Vargheim, was a skeleton of charred beams and collapsed roof sections. But among the ruins, signs of organized activity were clearly visible. Cleared pathways, sorted salvage, and the systematic approach of someone taking control of the recovery effort. There, Svala pointed toward the hall's remains, where a group of figures moved among the debris. Someone's been busy organizing things. As they drew closer, they could see that a temporary shelter had been erected using salvage materials and canvas. Around it, perhaps 20 survivors worked under clear direction, sorting through possessions, tending to wounded, and beginning the enormous task of rebuilding. At the center of the activity stood a familiar figure whose presence sent a chill through Svala's heart. Magnus the Keeper moved among the workers with the efficient authority of someone taking charge in a crisis. His clothes were soot-stained, and his face showed the exhaustion of someone who had worked through the night, but his bearing suggested a man who had found purpose in disaster. He directed the placement of supplies, assigned tasks to the workers, and spoke with the quiet confidence of established leadership. "Look how naturally he's assumed command," Kjell observed, his voice carrying the analytical tone of someone evaluating a tactical situation. "No one questions his authority because he's simply doing what needs to be done. By the time anyone thinks to challenge his position, he'll be too entrenched to remove easily." But it was the sight of the workers themselves that confirmed Svala's worst fears. These weren't random survivors who'd happened to gather at the settlement. They moved with the coordination of people following established plans. Some carried weapons that showed no signs of recent combat, despite the night's fierce fighting. Others seemed remarkably well supplied for people who had supposedly fled their homes in panic. "Staged," Svala said, understanding flooding through her. "Some of these people were never in real danger last night. They were positioned to survive the attack and provide Magnus with a ready-made support base." The final piece of evidence came when Magnus gestured towards something near the hall's foundation, and Svala saw what had been concealed by the angle of their approach. A group of prisoners sat bound near the temporary shelter, genuine survivors who had been captured rather than rallied to the reconstruction effort. Among them, she recognized faces of clan members whose loyalty to her father had been absolute. "He's already separating the loyal from the potentially useful," Kjell noted grimly. "Anyone who might question his version of events or remember too much about your father's suspicions is being eliminated from the equation." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Magnus hadn't simply opened the doors for Bloodraven's attack. He had orchestrated the entire night as a purge of opposition and a foundation for his own rise to power. The clan's traditional structures, its customs of loyalty and honor, had all been turned into weapons against the very people they were meant to protect. It was time to act. Kjell moved toward the damaged bell tower with the purposeful stride of someone executing a long-planned strategy. The bell rope had been damaged in the fire, but he produced a length of cord from his pack and began rigging a temporary pull system. His movements were quick and efficient, those of someone who had practiced this exact action many times. When I ring the bell, every loyal member of the clan within 5 miles will know what it means, he explained as he worked. Your father made sure that signal was understood by everyone who could be trusted, but it will also alert Magnus that we've returned and discovered his treachery. Svala nodded, understanding that they were committing themselves to a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone they cared about. There would be no retreat from this point, no opportunity to gather more evidence or plan more carefully. The bell's voice would announce that the true battle for Clan Vargheim's soul was beginning. Do it, she said, her hand moving to rest on the hilt of her sword. Around them, the other survivors took positions that would allow them to support whatever came next. The final test of leadership, loyalty, and courage was about to begin, and everything her father had tried to teach her about honor and strength would either prove sufficient for the challenge ahead or fail in the crucible of actual combat. Kjell pulled the improvised rope, and the ancient bell's voice rang out across the devastated settlement, its bronze tone carrying a message that had been planned years in advance, but never hoped to be needed. The sound echoed off the ruined buildings and rolled across the valley, calling all true members of Clan Vargheim to witness the moment, when masks would finally be torn away and the real enemy revealed. The bell's resonant call had barely faded when Magnus, the keeper's head, snapped up from his work, his face showing the shock of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been disrupted. For a moment he stood frozen among the ruins, calculating rapidly as he realized what the signal meant. Then his expression hardened into the cold determination of a man who had come too far to retreat. "Secure the prisoners," he barked to his supporters, his voice carrying none of the humble deference that had marked his years of service. "And arm yourselves. It seems Eric's daughter has returned to cause trouble." The transformation was immediate and chilling. The efficient coordinator of rescue efforts vanished, replaced by someone whose bearing spoke of long-hidden ambitions and carefully nurtured resentments. His followers moved with military precision to obey his commands, confirming that this moment had been anticipated and prepared for. But the bell's call was already bearing fruit. From the outlying areas around the settlement, figures began emerging. Survivors who had hidden in root cellars and storage sheds, workers who had been trapped in distant fields when the attack began, and warriors who had fought running battles through the night before retreating to safety. They came with weapons in hand and grim purpose in their faces, answering a summons they had hoped never to hear. Magnus realized quickly that his position was becoming untenable. "You've chosen poorly, Svala Eriksdottir," he called across the ruins, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Your father's time is past, and with it, the old ways that kept this clan weak and vulnerable. I offer strength through alliance with our former enemies, prosperity through practical accommodation with reality. You offer slavery dressed as diplomacy," Svala replied, stepping into view with Kjell at her side. "And you murdered my father to achieve it." The accusation hung in the air like a sword blade, and she saw the truth of it reflected in Magnus's face before he could mask his expression. Around the temporary shelter, those who had genuinely believed they were following legitimate leadership began to waver as the implications became clear. "Prove it," Magnus snarled, his hand moving to the sword at his belt. "Prove that I did anything but serve this clan faithfully, while your father's pride led us toward destruction." Svala produced the leather satchel they had discovered, holding it high so all could see. "The proof is in his own words, written in documents you thought buried with him. He knew there was a traitor. He was close to exposing you, so you helped his weak heart find its final rest." The effect on the assembled crowd was electric. Those who had followed Magnus out of genuine loyalty began stepping away from him, their faces showing the horror of people who realized they had been used. But his core supporters, those who had been positioned to survive the night's attack, closed ranks around their leader with the determination of men whose lives now depended on his success. The raider chief, who had been Magnus's partner in treachery, chose that moment to emerge from concealment behind the ruined hall, leading a group of blood-raven warriors who had remained hidden throughout the day. Their presence confirmed what everyone now understood. This had never been about rescue or rebuilding. It had been about conquest from within, using external enemies as tools to destroy internal opposition. "Enough talk," the Bloodraven chief declared, raising a sword that bore notches marking many kills. The girl dies, the documents burn, and Clan Vargheim accepts its new reality under joint leadership. But as the enemy warriors advanced, the sound of running feet and battle cries echoed from multiple directions. The bell's call had reached farther than Magnus had anticipated, and now armed figures poured into the settlement from every path and trail. Clan members who had thought themselves alone and defeated discovered that they were part of a larger group that had never truly been broken. Kjell stepped forward to meet the Bloodraven chief, his wood-cutting axe gleaming in the afternoon light. "You should have stayed in exile," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had faced death many times and learned not to fear it. "Your quarrel was with Eric, and Eric is dead. But you chose to threaten his daughter, and that was a mistake." The final battle erupted with shocking violence. Steel rang against steel as clan loyalists clashed with traitors and their external allies. Svala found herself fighting beside people she had known all her life, some of whom she was seeing clearly for the first time. The humble craftsmen showed warriors' skills. Elderly women wielded weapons with deadly competence, and children threw stones with accuracy that spoke of recent, bitter experience. At the center of the combat, Kjell engaged the Bloodraven chief in single combat that quickly became the focal point of the entire battle. His axework was a masterpiece of controlled violence, each stroke calculated to maximum effect while conserving energy for the prolonged fight he knew was coming. When the raider's sword finally shattered under the impact of his perfectly timed blow, the symbolic weight of victory began shifting toward Clan Vargheim. Magnus, seeing his allies falling and his carefully constructed plans crumbling, made one final desperate play for victory. But the evidence of his treachery was now undeniable, and even those who might have supported him from ambition rather than loyalty could see that his cause was lost. The betrayer found himself increasingly isolated as the battle raged around him, his dreams of power dissolving in the reality of consequences he had never been forced to face. 3 months later, as autumn's first frost silvered the grass around the rebuilt settlement of Clan Vargheim, Svala stood in the doorway of the new great hall and marveled at how much had changed since that terrible night. The building rose from the ashes of the old, but its design reflected hard-won wisdom about both external threats and internal vulnerabilities. Windows were positioned to provide clear sightlines. Multiple exits ensured that no future attack could trap the clan's leadership. And the high table had been replaced with a circular arrangement that emphasized equality over hierarchy. The morning sun streamed through those carefully placed windows as the clan gathered for their first formal feast since the night of betrayal and revelation. But this celebration carried a different spirit than the harvest feast that had preceded the attack. Where once there had been clear divisions between those who served and those who commanded, now there was an understanding that strength came in many forms, and that the most valuable contributions often came from the most unexpected sources. Kjell entered the hall carrying a simple wooden cup, carved from oak taken from the grove where they had rallied the survivors. It bore no silver inlay or jeweled decoration, but the craftsmanship was exquisite, the work of someone who understood that true beauty lay in perfect function rather than ornate display. He moved with the same quiet dignity that had always marked his actions, but now his presence commanded the respect that had always been his due. "The new cup is ready," he announced, setting the vessel on the central table where everyone could see it. "Made from wood that witnessed our darkest hour, shaped by hands that have learned the difference between serving and surrendering." Elder Thorvald, his weathered face bearing a smile that spoke of deep satisfaction. lifted the cup with the careful reverence due to a sacred object. "Let this be the vessel from which leadership drinks," he said, his ancient voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Not because it is precious, but because it reminds us that the most essential things are often the simplest." The old man filled the cup with mead and offered it first to Svala, as was proper for the clan's acknowledged leader. But she paused before drinking, looking around at the faces gathered in the circle, farmers and warriors, craftsmen and hunters, young and old, all united by their shared survival and their commitment to building something better from the ruins of what had been lost. "Before I drink," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came not from birth, but from proven leadership, "I want to speak of what we learned in our darkest hour. We learned that courage doesn't always announce itself with loud boasts or gleaming weapons. Sometimes it serves quietly at table, works steadily in kitchens, and shows its strength only when strength is truly needed." She turned to face Kjell directly, her expression serious but warm. "We learned that judging others by their station rather than their character is not just foolish, it's dangerous. It blinds us to both threats and allies, making us vulnerable to those who would exploit our prejudices while dismissing those who would protect us." The hall remained quiet as she continued, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something important, not just a speech, but a recognition of truths that had cost them dearly to learn. Magnus the Keeper betrayed us not just with weapons and enemies, but with our own assumptions about loyalty and worth. He counted on us believing that authority always knows best, that those who serve are somehow lesser than those who command, and that humble work means humble worth. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He was wrong about all of it. Svala raised the wooden cup, its simple surface catching the morning light. "Today we drink from a cup that honors service rather than status, crafted by hands that saved lives rather than voices that claimed credit. Let it remind us that in Clan Vargheim, worth is measured by deeds, not by decoration." She drank deeply, then passed the cup to Kjell. As he accepted it, their hands touched briefly, and in that contact was an acknowledgement of partnership built on mutual respect rather than the false hierarchies that had once divided them. When he drank, it was as an equal among equals, his quiet heroism finally receiving the recognition it had always deserved. The cup continued around the circle, shared by everyone present, regardless of their role in the clan's daily life. The woman who tended the goats drank from the same vessel as the veteran warriors. The boy who carried messages was honored equally with the skilled craftsman. In that sharing was a revolution, not the violent overthrow of tradition, but the thoughtful reformation of customs that had outlived their usefulness. As the feast progressed and the hall filled with the sounds of genuine celebration, Svala found herself observing the gathering with new eyes. She saw how the different members of the clan interacted, not as superior and subordinate, but as people whose various skills and contributions were all essential to their collective survival and prosperity. The attack by Bloodraven and Magnus's betrayal had nearly destroyed them, but it had also taught them something invaluable about the true sources of strength. They had learned that the most dangerous enemies were often those who seemed most trustworthy, while the greatest allies might be those who seemed most ordinary. As evening approached and the feast began to wind down, Svala stepped outside to look over the valley that was once again their secure home. The rebuilt settlements dotted the landscape like jewels, each one a testament to the hard work and cooperation that had made recovery possible. In the distance, sentries maintained their watch, not just the traditional warriors, but a mixture of clan members whose varied skills and perspectives made them far more effective than any single type of guard could be. Kjell joined her in the doorway, his presence as comfortable now as it had once been invisible. They stood together in companionable silence, two people who had learned to see past surface appearances to the deeper truths that mattered. "Your father would be proud," Kjell said finally, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had known Eric well and understood what he had hoped to achieve. "I think he would be proud of both of us," Svala replied, understanding that the greatest victory hadn't been defeating their enemies, but learning to recognize the allies who had been beside them all along. The simple wooden cup they had shared represented more than just a new tradition. It was a symbol of wisdom earned through hardship and a commitment to never again mistake humble service for humble worth.